I think of this a little bit as a master class uh, for Gone Astray, which is a text that I have read before and that I really love and that I have become immersed in and fascinated by and have lots of ideas about. Um, so the first thing that I want to do is make sure that everybody understands the basic events of the story. And there are some things that are likely to be confusing. And Molly has been very helpful to me in this regard because Molly is, as I've told her, is closer in age to the students. Molly's an undergrad at Santa Cruz. She's closer in age to the students in your schools who will be reading this essay for the first time. And there's some stuff that Molly has uh, added to the annotations. You should understand that the annotations are not the kinds of annotations that would appear in a scholarly edition of this text. There are a lot of annotations that are basic terms, pieces of vocabulary that are targeted at the high school audience. And there is also a lot of information that is historical background and things that, I had to refresh myself on as well and learn some new things in the process. So, just wanted to go over some basic events in the story that students will find confusing, uh, likely. And the first thing, and it's at the very beginning, is to explain to students, make sure that they know what the City of London is, because the City of London is not the same as Greater London. The City of London is the oldest part of the city, and we will the edition that we're producing will have a map, and the map will shade in brown the area that is the city and that is always referred to in the story as the city with a capital C. So the city is the place that where the boy in the story gets lost and wanders around. And so most of the locations are in the city. And one, there are lots of legends associated with the city, particularly the legend of Gog and Magog and the giants in the guild hall. And um, there are things that will need to be explained to students, I think. Um, but the city is uh, a place unto itself. It has its own uh, government. It has its own mayor, who is not the mayor of the greater city of London, who's an elected official. The Lord Mayor of the city of London is an honorary position, but one that has real power. And it's associated with the myth of Dick Whittington. And that's another thing that is important for you to know and for students to know. Um, so uh, the 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 city of London is run by uh, its own local government called the corporation, and there's a reference to the corporation in the story. And the Lord Mayor is the mayor, the head of the corporation. And so the story of Dick Whittington, it is a basic story in Dickens and in English folklore. And it's a rags to riches story. Dick Whittington is a poor boy who uh, comes to London from the country and imagines that the streets are paved with gold in London. He's seeking his fortune, and he has a cat. He obtains a cat, and the cat is a famous rat catcher. And he goes to work for a man named Fitzwarren as a scullion, washing dishes in the kitchen. And Mr. Fitzwarren is a wealthy merchant, and he has a ship that is uh, sailing on a voyage, and he asks every member of his household to make an investment, however small an investment, in this expedition, which is going to Barbary, that is the north coast of Africa in the Mediterranean. And all that Dick Whittington has to invest is his cat. And so the cat goes on board ship, and when it gets and it cleans out all the rats on the ship, and when it gets to um, Barbary, the king of Barbary has a rat problem too, and so Dick's cat cleans out all the cats in the king's castle, and the king rewards the ship for this miraculous event. And so when the ship comes back to London, Mr. Fitzwarren rewards Dick Whittington with lots of money because his investment paid off. And so then Dick Whittington marries the daughter of Mr. Fitzwarren and eventually becomes Lord Mayor of London. So it's a rags to riches story. And there's one other piece in the story that's sort of a different part, not related to the trip to Barbary, which is that at one point when before the ship goes to Barbary, Dick is discouraged and he thinks he'll leave London and go back to the country. And as he's leaving town, the bells of a church ring, and he hears a voice that says, "Turn again, Dick Whittington, Lord Mayor of London." And so this is a kind of prophetic voice that summons him back to the city and predicts that he will become the Lord Mayor of London. So the Whittington story is basic to what's going on in Gone Astray. Now, the story gets published in August of 1853, and that date is important to locate it in relation to Dickens's career. Now, the last monthly number, the double monthly number of Bleak House, appears in September of 1853. So the text that is closest to Gone Astray is Bleak House. And that's important for a couple of reasons for me. One is that, Bleak House is the great Dickens novel. It's the most wonderful, it's the magnificent piece of writing. So Dickens is writing Gone Astray at the height of his powers as a novelist. And I think it's a great example of Dickens at his very best. And there's actually one part of Gone Astray that is directly connected to Bleak House. And it's a long paragraph, maybe two paragraphs in the middle of the essay, in which he talks about the friend in the city. And if you remember in Bleak House, there is a lot about the friend in the city. So what is the friend in the city? In Bleak House, Soldier George, Trooper George, has a debt. And the debt is held by Mr. Smallweed. And Mr. Smallweed is a moneylender, and every year he renews the loan, and George doesn't have anything to worry about. But one year, Mr. Smallweed says to George, I'm not going to renew the loan. And the explanation that he gives is that he has a friend in the city who demands that the loan be called. So this puts George in a terrible situation now. Who is the friend in the city? The friend in the city, there actually turns out to be a friend in the city in Bleak House, who is Mr. Tulkinghorn. And Mr. Tulkinghorn, the lawyer, wants information that Trooper George has. And so he's squeezing Trooper George, and he will renew the loan only if um, Trooper George gives him the information, which is information about Lady Deadlock, and that's what's going on in Bleak House. But the friend in the city, in a more general way, and this is what is difficult, I think, about Gone Astray, is a kind of mythical figure, not necessarily a real person. It's that if you need something done, uh, you appeal to the friend in the city. I've got a friend in the city who's got connections and who's influential, and he's a kind of fixer. He's like Donald Trump's fixer, who can arrange things and you know, lend you money, take care of any problems that you have. But the problem with having a friend in the city, this mythical figure who's going to be the fixer, uh, is that the friend in the city is not reliable. And at any moment, the friend in the city can turn on you and uh, turn out to be a swindler or a crook. And then you're really up a creek because the friend in the city turns out not to be a real friend. So he's a kind of mythical figure who may be real and may not be real. Um, uh, and so that whole section where the narrator of Gone Astray talks about the friend in the city is spoken by the narrator with the knowledge of how unreliable the friend in the city can be and usually is, because the friend in the city doesn't necessarily tell the truth. Says I'll fix things, but uh, but doesn't turn out to be the fixer that the client, the person who's in debt, thinks he will be. So that's a long section that's a little bit confusing because it's spoken with the knowledge of the older narrator, not the boy. The boy doesn't know about the friend in the city. But what's really useful, I think, for purposes of this story, is that the friend in the city is or can be both an imaginary figure and a real figure. And that I think is related to the theme of the story, which is about the fuzzy boundaries between the real and the imaginary. Um, so what else? There was another thing I wanted to make sure that you understand about the events in the story. Um, and Dick Whittington, there's the legend of Gog and Magog. There are these giants, figures of giants in the Guildhall in London. And Gog and Magog are creatures who are monsters who are mentioned in the Bible, but they have a particular role in English history because, for reasons that are too complicated to go in, they are in English history, they are associated legendarily with the protectors of London. And so their statues stand 14 feet tall in the Guildhall. And the boy in Gone Astray wants to go visit the giants. And for him, the giants hover in this in-between space between real and fictional. And that again, I think is related to the story. So he wants to go visit the giants. And the story of the giants are also related to Jack and the Beanstalk, the other story that is invoked in the story, because in Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack gets a bean and plants it and wakes up, and the beanstalk has gone up to heaven, and he climbs the beanstalk, and it takes him to the land of the giants, and through some trickery, he manages to steal a fortune from the giants and come back down to Earth, and he's a wealthy man. So it's another story about, a boy from nowhere who uh, comes into contact with giants and comes back with a fortune, and that's another component to the story. Um, uh, what else is there? Uh, the the play that the boy goes to see at the end of the story is it's a wonderful uh, show that he attends because it's cheap theater. It's cheap 19th century theater. It's in a cheap uh, down market theater, and it's a kind of variety show. There's a bunch of stuff going on, comic stuff with the comic actor who's sort of the MC of the program, and then there is a play that gets performed, and the play is a nautical melodrama, which is a kind of theatrical piece that was important at the beginning of the 19th century, in which they staged battles and storms, sometimes with great basins of water and elaborate productions. And so one of the things that the boy sees is, I don't think it's a full play, but anyway, it's part of a nautical melodrama in which they bring a man of war ship on stage. They pretend that there's a storm, and the mast of the ship gets blown overboard. But of course, it's really one of the actors who picks up the mast and tosses it off the stage. They Then there's a fight that takes place between um, uh, two sailors. One is a good sailor and one is a bad sailor. And this is typical melodrama fare, with extremes of good and bad. And the boy notices that one of the actors is standing on the edge of the ship, but it looks to him very much like it's a, 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 a ladder or something. And so the boy is noticing these details that he takes as the truth, a real ship and a real mast going overboard, but it's actually all just the fake stuff that is going on stage. So he can't distinguish between what's real, what's true, and what's invented, what's part of the performance. Now, there seems to be another melodrama that's also performed, probably not in its entirety, in which there's um, a, a little girl who is in danger, and there's an evil baron who comes, and the baron is going to do something bad to the little girl, and then uh, there are fireworks and an explosion and a happily ever after kind of ending. And we don't know enough about this to know really what the plot is, but it's a second melodrama uh, in which there's a Newfoundland dog that appears and a bell that gets rung, and these are typical props and stunts that occur in Victorian melodrama. So the part of the joke of this is that the boy can't quite distinguish between what's real and what's imaginary, and that theme of enchantment and disenchantment, the narrator can always tell. The narrator sees through the pretend stuff, but the boy imagines this as real giants, real ship, real struggle, real good and bad people, and so on. So that's another part of the story that will be a little bit confusing to uh, students, I think. And the main thing that the boy is worried about is the ticket lottery, because the winner of the ticket lottery gets a donkey, and the boy is worried because uh, what will he do if number 47, his ticket, is the lucky number? And um, so uh, he, what's interesting there is that the boy doesn't have any idea that the donkey is a piece of fiction. The boy thinks that this is a very real donkey and that he might have to take the very real donkey home with him. And how's he going to feed it? How's he going to explain it to his parents and all of that? So he's in terror throughout the play that his number may be drawn. But all of this goes back to the Dick Whittington story, because Dick Whittington uh, goes from rags to riches because he's lucky. And in the play, if uh, the boy has the lucky number, he'll get not fame and fortune, but he'll get a donkey that he has to take care of. And so luck is not always good luck in this story. Luck is sometimes bad luck. And so he's worried that he may have luck, but it will be bad luck. So anyway, those are some of the events in the story that I think are confusing. And the point of, one of the big points in the story is that the narrator knows lots of things that the boy doesn't. And the boy is living in a world of enchantment. And he's living in the world of fairy tales. He's living in the world of legends, of Dick Whittington, of Gog and Magog, of giants, of Jack and the Beanstalk. And so everything that he sees after he separates from somebody, the adult companion, is colored by his fantasy life and is a kind of projection of his fantasy life. Now, there's one other event that I think is really, it's a little confusing. And I just want to make sure that you all understand. And it's at the very beginning of the story. And the question is, why do his parents, why do the boy's parents want him to go to visit St. Giles's church? And he has romantic ideas and tender shoots. And so what is this romantic fire that the boy has that his parents want to quench? And I think that will be confusing to students. And it's in the very beginning, the first two paragraphs of the story. And one part of the romantic fire is that the boy has just had a birthday and he's gotten a present from his girlfriend who's 6 years old. He's 8 or 9 years old, and he's in love. This part of what is romantic at the beginning is his fantasy of being in love with and eventually marrying his sweetheart, who has given him a ring that he carries with him as a kind of good luck charm. But his parents disapprove. They may disapprove of the 8-year-old fantasy of a girlfriend that he's going to marry, who's of a different Protestant sect from the boy, who's a Church of Englander and she's a Wesleyan, a Methodist. But I think what the parents are really bothered by is the excess of imagination that the boy has. He's got this wild fantasy that he describes at the beginning about beggars. And his fantasy is that all the beggars of London are really fakes. They're not real beggars. They're just pretending to be beggars. and that a guy named I have to look up his name because it's so strange.
Bamfilda Moore Carew.
Bamfield Moore Carew is his name. And Bamfield Moore Carew was a real person, an 18th century. I had to look him up in Wikipedia and get a little more information. Was Wikipedia describes him as a vagabond and rogue uh, in the 18th century who ran away and lived with the gypsies and became known or claimed to be the king of the gypsies and the king of the beggars. So the boy has this fantasy that a contemporary successor to this 18th century vagabond and rogue is going to summon all the beggars of London to come to St. Giles's church because St. Giles, for whom the church is named, is the patron saint of beggars. So one Sunday, all the beggars in London are going to cast off their robes, dress up in fancy Sunday clothes, come to church, and Bamfield Moore Carew is going to preside over a Sunday ceremony in which the beggars will participate. Now, this is totally improbable and fantastic, but it's an example of the boy's fantasy life. And I think his parents are worried uh, that he's too imaginative. He's hyper imaginative. And so they would like him, they would like his romantic fire, his, his hyper imaginative self to get some practical sense. So, a friend of the family, a relative whose name the boy cannot remember or pretends not to remember, volunteers to take him to visit St. Giles's church, where he will see that there is no Bamfield Moore Carew. Uh, there are no beggars who have come on Sunday. And this will mean that he won't have these kinds of dangerous fantasies, which may also include fantasies about marrying his sweetheart and stuff like that. So that's what launches this entire story, is that the parents want to quench his romantic fire, which is his excess of imagination. And so somebody, the character Nate, whom he calls somebody, takes him to visit St. Giles's church. But, and this is the crisis that happens early, I lost him. I lost somebody. And from that point on, for the long middle of the story, the boy wanders through London, through the city of London, and goes to visit the sites that are named. So it's an imaginative journey made by the young boy through a very real London, which is also an imaginary London that he has constructed in his mind based on these legends and fairy tales and myths and the Arabian Nights and everything. And one basic question is, who is somebody? Why can't he remember somebody? And this, I think, is a crucial part of the story. That somebody is both a real person and an imaginary person. Somebody is like the friend in the city, that is both an invention of the boy, or an invention, rather, of the older narrator, an invention of Dickens, who takes the boy on a journey whose ostensible purpose is to make him practical, to get rid of the excess of imagination. But in fact, what somebody does, and this is ambiguous, and I think it's wonderful, is to take him, it's as if somebody were to take an 8-year-old child to Disneyland and drop them in Disneyland and give them $10 and turn them loose to wander through Disneyland on their own. So somebody is both a real person from whom he gets lost and an imaginary person who has introduced him to Disneyland, to a fantasy world. In that sense, he's a double of the friend in the city, but the friend in the city is unreliable and dangerous and can't be trusted. But somebody is someone who has introduced the boy to a magical, wonderful world of the imagination in which all of the legends that he has been reading about the Arabian Nights actually look as if they could come true. And so the boy is wandering through Fantasyland, but Fantasyland is also a real land. So he runs into a dog and he wants to turn the dog into, a magical animal helper like Dick Whittington's cat. But the dog won't behave like a dog in a fantasy. He won't be Mary Chance. He's a real dog, and he eats the boy's sausage. And similarly, the play at the end is a fantasy, but there's a real donkey in the play, and you can't turn a real donkey into an animal helper because the real donkey is a problem, not a helper. And so always the story is bouncing back and forth between the idea of fantasy and the reality that the older narrator knows about. So one other piece of background that I want to run past you, which is that everything in this story, the narrator claims at the very end, is literally true. Literally. That is, this happens, we can date it to the spring of 1820. Dickens turned 8 on February 7th, 1820. And he claims that all of this stuff really happened, that he'd newly come to London, and Dickens' family moved from Chatham to London in 1820 or 1821. It's a little unclear. But anyway, he's a boy who has newly arrived in London, and he's with somebody who is also newly arrived in London and who's dressed in funny clothes. And somebody's funny clothes are also important. And this is something that connects with Great Expectations too, because you remember when Joe Gargery comes to London, he dresses up in his Sunday best clothes and he looks ridiculous because he's not a native of London. He's a country bumpkin, and Pip is ashamed of him and embarrassed. But in Gone Astray, the boy thinks that somebody, the adult friend, is a mirror of fashion. He actually quotes Hamlet there and compares him to Hamlet. And he describes his costume, his clothing, and it's blue and red and yellow, and it's got gold buttons, and he's got a monstrous high collar. And anybody who lives in London would immediately recognize somebody as a country bumpkin, um, as somebody who's not from London, who doesn't dress like the people in London. But the boy doesn't see him that way. The boy sees him as somebody very much like himself, that is, who's from the country and who's a kind of mythical figure at the same time. So I would claim this, and here I'm sort of shading off into a literary interpretation of Gone Astray, remembering that this is Bleak House time and that this is Dickens, the great novelist, who is both telling a true story, one that's literally true, something he remembers. He remembers all the details of, but that is also a kind of fairy tale that he has invented in which somebody is, and this is a different story that isn't mentioned specifically in Gone Astray, but I think hovers behind it, is the Pied Piper of Hamelin, who comes to town, uh, catches rats for the king. The king won't pay him for catching the rats. And so the Pied Piper leads the children of the city, the town of Hamelin, it's the Pied Piper of Hamelin, uh, leads them off and they disappear. So the city loses all of its children because the king would not pay his debt. But in Dickens's version of the story, the Pied Piper is someone who leads the boy on a magical journey, takes him to Disneyland, to Fantasyland, um, introduces him to the world of the imagination, doesn't steal him away from the city. It's a different interpretation of the Pied Piper, who in the version that most people know is someone who's playing a trick on the king and getting revenge on the king because the king didn't pay his debts. But in Dickens's version of it, the Pied Piper is this guy dressed up in fantastic, colorful clothing who leads the boy on an imaginative journey to Giant Land, um, where he learns about the Arabian Nights or sees the Arabian Nights. He goes to the city. You know, remember this, the city is the financial center of London. It's the hub of the British Empire. Um, and uh, uh, Dickens comes back from that journey a wealthy, famous novelist. His childhood fantasy, his childhood world of fantasy is the world that Dickens draws on for his imagination. And somebody, the figure of somebody, has led him there, introduced him to that world. And Dickens, the adult narrator, the novelist who tells the story, and has constructed a kind of fairy tale in which his own fantasy life has enabled him to become a novelist. So the story is about an initiation into fantasy as the source of imaginative power. And that's what I think is so wonderful about this story. Now, uh, at the end of the story, the narrator says, people said I was an odd boy. Uh, I may be an odd man, perhaps. And that's the link between the boy and the man. That being odd, being imaginative, is the source of imaginative power and life. Um, and so I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. There's one other bit that I'll point out to you, which is that when the boy goes to the play, he's all by himself and he pays his own entrance. And there are adults around him who sort of look at him, give him a funny look, and think, why are you here on your own? And what he does then is to pretend that he's with somebody, an adult, um, and looks around. And that somebody that he invents, the adult companion, is like the somebody who accompanies him on the journey, drops him in Disneyland. And the boy all along is inventing these made up people, including the friend in the city, who's the dangerous friend. But those three are the imaginative friends, the imaginary friends that the boy and the novelist invent. So it's a real story that tracks precisely with 1820 and Dickens' newly come to London. Um, but it's also an imaginative story, a fairy tale about where Dickens's imagination comes from. So that's my reading of the story, um, and I think it's I think it's just a brilliant piece of writing by Dickens.